Welcome to MedHeads, the weekly show that brings a biopsychosocial focus to issues of the day, along with special guests who will showcase their expertise and enthusiasm about their field of practice. Your host, Dr. Fergal Armstrong.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Fergal Armstrong and welcome to this episode of MedHeads. And today we have Maree Eisma, mental health social worker. Hello Maree, can you hear me? Can you see me?
Hello, certainly can.
How are you today?
I'm well, and yourself?
No, very good, very good. So the last time we talked, we're touching about your views on alcohol and other drugs and your therapeutic engagement and your style. So to continue from that, I just wanted to ask you first of all, what role do you see families having in the management of a patient with alcohol and other drugs?
They have an integral role. Often when I'm working with clients, I tend to go, like whenever I'm doing family work, I'm always thinking, even if I've only got one client in front of me, I'm thinking 3 generations ahead of of what's gone on before I actually work with a client. So what we often find out is when we track the story, most people who, it's been my clinical experience, and I'd love to know if this has been yours too, Fergal, but very seldom is it the client who's actually using this substance who actually seeks out help first. My experience has usually been it's the family member who's tearing their hair out, it's the spouse, it's the, it's certainly not the client themselves. Can you relate to that?
Oh, totally. Yeah. It's usually a distraught wife or mother. That's what I can remember.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing is that usually, and I was only just doing some work on this yesterday, is, when we look at even our people who are sort of in and out of our mental health systems, what we often find is that the issue of substances is in there, but it's very seldom the identified issue. It's, like even child youth mental health services, it's usually the squeaky wheel, the presenting person is often never the one who's really got the issue. It's just the one who is usually the scapegoat in the family who highlights that something's completely skewy with the family.
So just let me reflect back. Are you saying then that a patient with alcohol and substance use disorders is actually a harbinger of a greater issue in the family? Is it possible to have an isolated substance use disorder within a family?
No, because anyone else who's around that is impacted. I was only working with this not that long ago where, so if I break down it in a clinical example, say for argument's sake, you've got a tween girl who whose parents, whose mum, say, is really kind of very anxious person. Say the father is drinking heavily. The daughter in some ways, say for argument's sake, the father's got a lot of trust issues, doesn't really know how to cope. The moment she starts saying, look, I want to go and have a sleepover at my friend's place, his anxiety starts going up. He starts drinking more. The wife doesn't like how much the husband starts drinking. And then the tween will then sometimes go, oh, no, this is destabilizing everything. I feel bad for mum. Mum's not coping. Dad's going to start drinking more. So you can see how even in the individuation process for that child, how things get stifled. So I've never in my clinical experience ever seen somebody who has a substance abuse issue and not have it impact on the remaining or other subsequent members of the family.
Oh yeah, I wasn't suggesting that. I was asking you to clarify the point, because what you said originally made me think was that there's no such thing as a substance use disorder de novo. There's always some blame, fault on the rest of the family. Is that what you're saying?
No. Some of the things that have usually got caught up is boundaries are often a big issue for people assuming responsibility for other people. there's a secrecy, a legacy of secrecy that tends to go on with substance abuse issues. I've had many times where I've worked with clients, only when I've actually rang the mothers, they will actually then say, oh, no, my daughter hasn't told you that my husband's actually got a drinking problem. So there seems to be this secrecy in not sharing actually really what's going on, but it's part of the bigger issue.
Right. So is it fair to say then, in terms of the biblical quotation, the sins of the father are visited upon the sons, nay, onto the seventh generation, is that true? Like, for instance, I'm Irish, and there's this kind of a stereotypical view that alcoholism just runs down the male line. Do you think that's true?
No, because I think, well, I remember a classic example, and it was given to me. It was actually before I had a career change and I worked in pharmacy, and the pharmacist actually said to me, he gave the example of two boys who were, say, 18 months apart. Now, the father had been in and out of jail, massive history of substance abuse issues and criminal goings on. And the two sons were interviewed. Now, one son went down exactly the same road as his father, and the other son did the complete opposite. And when the two boys were then put together and said, what led to you choosing the lines that you took in your world and the lifestyles you created, they both said, with a father like mine, what do you expect?
Yes.
So interpretation and meaning. Well, obviously someone, and this is where it bewilders me, because we like to sit there and think that there are certain things that make certain situations happen, but then we get these examples where somebody rebels or somebody doesn't take on the script, somebody makes a different choice, and where three children in a family, each and every one of them adapts differently, and takes on a different role in the actual dimensions within the family. So yeah.
Do you think it could be genetic? I mean, there are genetic differences between children that can explain the drug liking phenomenon, the initial impulsivity to drug taking.
Absolutely.
So in the example that you gave, I presume the children were not twins; they were non-twin children of this alcoholic father.
Absolutely. There was an 18-month age gap.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've seen this too, where I know people have been adopted. And then when they've actually met their biological families, their parents have had a major drinking problem or a major substance abuse issue. So, I mean, there is genetic, there's no two ways about it. There is genetic variables in there, totally.
So then does go back to the sins of the father are visited upon the sons. I mean, that is alluding to a genetic predisposition, isn't it?
I think there's a predisposition, but I don't always think it actually means that somebody will there might be a vulnerability to it, but I don't think it actually always becomes the catalyst of someone actually using or falling. Or so I mean, I know other people who have, they've had parents who have had substance abuse issues, but they've had a food addiction.
Yes. So predisposition does not inevitably mean the development of a substance use disorder. It is a vulnerability. So I suppose one could ask the question, having a vulnerability is half the journey. So what, in your view, makes one cross the line into frank substance use disorder?
From my clinical experience, it's been things like low self-esteem. It's been, having capacity. I think one of the things that when we peel things back when it comes to families is, say, for argument's sake, some parents don't know how to model emotional attunement. Like a child, might have a meltdown or has an uproar of behaviours or something, and the parent misattributes, you just need to have a little sleep, when in fact maybe the child is actually ropeable and angry. So I think if we sometimes peel things back, what we often find is that a child hasn't been able to have a complete understanding of emotion and what they're feeling, and what I call like emotional repertoire or emotional labeling of exactly what they're experiencing. So it's like they learn to distrust their own perceptions or their own judgments, or they misattribute, you know, something going on with the parent, then they think that's something to do with them. I mean, we know that core schemas and, you know, those core beliefs are often, you know, already starting to form between the ages of 5 to 8 in children. And we know that unconsciously they will take on things when they didn't have an adult brain to be able to rationalize that. And I think those core beliefs become formed, and then they play out through the course of life. And if a parent isn't possibly giving the news of difference to say, hey, you know, I know that's how you're seeing things, but that's actually not how it is, the child just goes off to conclude, well, that's exactly how it is. That must be true. You know, it's kind of like the glasses that people, it's like the glasses that people then see the world through. They become the lens that people then make sense of their world. And if it's actually how they really truly do believe it to be, then they will often then bring people into their world that will step into the role that will either confirm that belief or the news of it being not accurate in their sphere becomes too different, and then they dispel it, and then they'll just seek people to reenact or refamiliarize what's familiar to them. Does that make sense?
Are you saying then that addiction, however one chooses to define it, is fundamentally developed in childhood?
No, I think if we don't understand things like self-esteem, so when we look at things like in a family, what will often happen is, you know, say you've got two parents who one's got an addiction, one hasn't, but the mother might not bring it up. They don't want to shake the cage. They don't want to, you know, sometimes if you really think about substance use, it's the biggest way of avoiding emotional intimacy within a relationship. Really, when you think about it, if a husband or a wife needs to constantly go off and become, obliterated as far as in substances, then that leaves, you know, there's a thing that Bowen talks about, which is he refers to as differentiation of self. And essentially what that means is that when we attract a partner, we are attracting somebody who has an equal capacity for emotional attunement or emotional development. And
right.
you can understand why it wouldn't work. If somebody's really, really emotionally got it together and, you know, perhaps has a really good use of language, and then you've got somebody who doesn't even know what they think or feel or anything like that, you could see how a relationship like that won't go a huge distance.
Right, but what's that got to do with us choosing partners who have equal capacity for emotional attunement?
Because if someone can't get that attunement, they will seek it somewhere else. Now, whether that be in an affair, whether that be in a substance, whether that be, they'll do anything like, okay, so for argument's sake, I was having a discussion with a friend yesterday, and she was saying to me that her parents just said, look, I just want you to go and find somebody who looks like they might be really financial. But when we peel that back, it's because the family didn't have any capacity for emotional connection. So the parents were just like saying, look, as long as this person ticks these criteria, yes, they're financial, yes, they look like they've got a house, they're stable. That was in some way the modelling that this girl believed to take on. So, of course, she goes off and then does this, finds a partner who's basically on the spectrum, and guess what? It doesn't work because
right.
it
how
wasn't
does that tie
really
into addiction.
Because it's like sometimes okay, so this person doesn't go and use substances, but if she was still caught up with the belief that her family have said to her, you know, this is what it means, you just keep doing what you're doing, and she doesn't have enough courage in herself to say, I'm not going to do this, this isn't right, we can see how, you know, somebody like that might start looking at having a wine at 5 o'clock. You know, we pay a really heavy price when we go up against the vow that we've made in our families, and sometimes that vow disrupts our central nervous system, so that in an effort of somehow trying to calm ourselves or try to bolster the unpleasant feelings, people can be vulnerable to using substances to change an emotional state.
So what you're saying then is that our issues within our family create a dysphoria, and that dysphoria drives us to drink and drugs.
Yes, and I think I've seen this happen many, many times where, like, and I think I alluded to this in perhaps one of our other talks, is, you know, where, you know, I've seen this with families who have got very, very strong religious beliefs, but their son is realizing that he's actually not in the right gender. And to have to go up against the family to be able to say, look, his real sense of self was, I have to live in the trueness of me believing I'm actually female. But to go up against the family and actually say, look, the son that you thought I was is actually, I'm not the son that you really want me to be. I'm actually female. I identify as female. He's stuck with this horrible quandary of, I'm going to be abandoned by my tribe, because to do this and to really step into his authentic self will mean he's then got to potentially sit with disapproval, abandonment, and humans. Abandonment is a massive thing that we have struggled with since we were born.
So why? I mean, I love the concept of abandonment as causing unhappiness and addiction. For you, why is abandonment so important for your patients?
Oh, because essentially abandonment is, that is worse than death. When we're sorry, what were you going to say?
Sorry to interrupt, right? But this, for me, you've just used the word death. But when we think of ourselves as ancient man, Stone Age man, we were all happy around a campfire, part of the group, and the campfire was able to give us the protection that we needed from the big bad world outside. The minute we become ostracized or abandoned and we have to survive in the jungle on our own, we are sentenced to death.
Correct.
Because ancient man could not have survived without being part of a tribe.
Absolutely.
So for me, abandonment is an existential death sentence.
Absolutely. And no one knows how, and I touched on this last time, is, when it comes to self-soothing, who teaches us how to self-soothe? Our caregivers. And I think you bring up a beautiful point, and that is that, years ago, we grew up with tribe, we grew up with community. Yeah. And I don't want to, go down the road of stereotypical imagery that the man's out there with, spears and hunting and gathering, but essentially they would.
That would be the women with the gathering.
Women would be the gathering. The guys would go off and do the hunting and have their own time. But there would be this also connection in, sometimes they would have their conversations about, where buffaloes might be, or where, a meat source would be. And there would be some togetherness, whether it be, sharpening spears, but guys would be together. Yes. But then they would go off and they would sort of, disperse and do what they needed to do. Women would be sitting around, perhaps collecting berries. There was many, many eyes upon children when we were growing up. It wasn't just the job of our mum or our dad. Yes. So we got to know a sense of greater safety because there was this kind of holding pattern that existed with many other women or many other people with, within that tribe. So even if mum or dad was a bit shirty with us or whatever, there was somebody else who would still be in that space that says, you know what, you're actually okay. I see you. There was that capacity for other maternal experiences there, even if perhaps the person who birthed us wasn't capable.
Or nurturing experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah. The person who birthed us may not have the capacity to nurture. And we see this, how often, I know I see it in my work with, with parents who have got, with a young person who might have a narcissistic mother or a narcissistic father, who actually doesn't have the capacity to, to have that felt sense of, you are loved unconditionally, you matter. And in the eyes of the child, I exist and I'm fundamentally, despite all my flaws, I'm actually lovable. So, we see that if somebody comes from the lens of not feeling okay and they're unloved or they've got those other core beliefs and essentially they're the breeding grounds for poor self-esteem, when we track things intergenerationally, what will often happen is even if somebody chooses not to go down the road of perhaps using substances themselves, if their role within the family has been the caregiver, the rescuer, the placator, they will then actually be at greater risk of potentially finding somebody who actually has a substance abuse issue.
So what you're saying is that someone whose identity is dependent on them being a caregiver or a placator and nurturer they will then, when they go out into the big bad world, they will then choose someone that they still have to nurture, protect, and placate. That's
Exactly.
called,
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely. And
isn't that called the Mary Magdalene syndrome?
absolutely. And people who have got, people who are codependent or, enablers in situations, sometimes actually their sense of self only comes to them because of the martyr role that they've got with somebody else, but they don't realize it. That's the sad thing. So when we do a genogram as someone who's trained in family therapy, we're looking for that, because what you will always see. You would have studied the Cartman drama triangle? Do you remember that drama triangle with the?
Tell me.
You'd know it. I'm sure. Where you've got the victim, you've got the rescuer, and you've got the persecutor.
Oh yeah. Sorry, forgive me, but I forgot the eponym.
Well, it goes under different titles, but essentially, and we know, the example I give when it comes to this is, the person who's the victim. So the example might be, Fred goes to the pub and is debriefing to Phil because Fred's been turfed out of his house because his wife got that jacked off of him being drunk again, and she's basically said, "Look, scram, I've had enough." So Fred's in there having a debrief to Phil, who says, "Oh, mate, that's really bad news. How about you come back to my place, and we'll make sure that you're not stuck out under a park bench. You sleep on my couch. We'll sort this out. We'll get a housing service involved, blah, blah, blah." But then what ends up happening is Fred doesn't really want to stop drinking at all. So now what happens is Fred just decides to start drinking on Phil's couch. And now all of a sudden Phil's in the doghouse because his relationship is the partner that he's got's going, "Listen, this benevolence of having Fred on our couch is becoming a problem. I couldn't even sit down and watch my TV the other day because Fred was there." Or Fred rocked in at, 12 o'clock midnight, blind drunk, stumbling and falling over. And now all of a sudden, Phil has to raise the issue.
So Phil becomes the persecutor, whereas previously he was the rescuer.
Yeah, and also, but everyone moves around the triangle. So what happens is Fred then turns around and goes, when Phil has to have the topic, brings up the topic of conversation, saying to Fred, "Listen, you're kind of extending your goodwill, you're kind of exploiting the situation. Now I think you really need to consider moving out. You haven't done a single thing like you suggested that you would, or that really Phil wanted to have happen." Fred turns around and goes, "Yeah, well, I never asked for your help. I didn't actually ask for your help. You just chose to do that for me." And then Phil feels, Phil's actually become the victim because now Phil can't get Fred off the couch. So, and then all of a sudden, and Hanny can also swing to being a persecutor, such as, "You ungrateful dog, look what I went and did for you." So you can see how the whole triangle, people move around the
how is
dynamic.
That relevant to this discussion?
Well, it's in another way when a person is a placater, or when a person has had their identity shrouded in being the people pleaser, the fixer, the carer, they will unconsciously be at risk of enacting that out further in the partner that they pick. And then the cycle continues. So when we track this in three generations, you'll often see that this is a pattern. So even if they choose not to become the drug person who actually uses substances themselves, their identity is only made in connection to the substance in some way. So they're vulnerable.
Yeah. So to what extent does our discussion relate to the following concept that addiction is the third person in a relationship?
Oh, big time. Sometimes, and as I said, if we take it back to the work of Bowen, as I said, talking around our capacity to be able to sit with, a level of emotional distress, and how we can actually, bring up touchy subjects, and how we can actually hold our own in response to, perhaps differences of opinion. So, you know, a lot of relationships have this thing around, you know, it's kind of reciprocal. So if a partner thinks that somebody's substance use is getting a little bit precarious, or perhaps, you know, sometimes people say, look, I'm going to put $70 aside for your alcohol for the week as part of the budget. But say that person then comes in seeking counselling because now all of a sudden the partner's now starting to blow $80, $90, $100. You know, that becomes like this kind of a vow in the relationship has now become kind of compromised or violated in some way. So somebody will then come and say to me, look, you know, I'm not happy. Fred's now starting to drink more than we actually agreed. And so that person now starts to feel that they're losing either their perception of control about how much that person's drinking, and that in some ways it now starts to flip from he's just having a couple of drinks to now he's escaping. You know, I'll never forget one day, I'd worked with this woman for a long time, and her partner had a major cannabis problem, and they actually ended up breaking up. The relationship went through its course, and about 7 years after the relationship ended, they ended up they still remained friends despite everything. But she actually heard something that was so profound. He actually said they had to go on a big trip. They ended up doing a big travel to, I think it was Western Australia. So you could appreciate there was him in the car, there was her in the car, and then there was the bong. And, you know, of course, he was continually stoned. But then by the time, you know, after 7 years of this relationship and it finally ending, he actually got straight. And he actually said to her, you know, I never realised how lonely you actually must have been in that relationship all this time. Mm. And for her, she thought, wow. Mm. So, yeah, it is like a third person in the relationship. You know, somebody wants to, you know, sit there and be affectionate, and that person is sitting out there having drinks, or too busy, preoccupied in scoring, or who's just gone to jail, or who's been done by the police the night before. Anything that you know, when we talk about triangulation, so in a healthy relationship, in a dyadic relationship, we've got person A and person B. But when triangulation occurs, instead of what's been sorted out between person A and person B, it's like something now named C comes into it. And that C could be anything from a person taking up golf and becoming obsessed about it, or C becoming, as I said, a substance abuse. But essentially what's happening is it's taking away the energy that would otherwise be available to person A and person B in the dyadic relationship. Does that kind of make sense?
That makes perfect sense, Maree. We're going to have to close this episode down, but I really hope that you'd agree to talk more upon this subject and share with us your wisdom in a later episode.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thank you for watching this episode of MedHeads. My name is Dr. Fergal Armstrong, and I hope you all join us again soon.